Cecilia. Thank you also to the conference organizers for having me. What I wanted to do today is deliver a response of sorts to a moment in Gabriele Salvatore's film Mediterranea from 1991. It's a well-known movie. It won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. It tells the story of a group of Italian soldiers who find themselves stranded on a Greek island in the Dodecanese during World War II. And over the course of their time, they fall in love with the place and its inhabitants. There's this moment early on when the soldiers are exploring the island, and it's already clear that none of them want to be soldiers. They're teachers, artists, and so on, good men. They enter a church and they meet its Greek Orthodox priest, who happens to speak Italian. He tells them the Germans have already been there and it was terrible, but with the Italians it'll be okay because una faccia una razza, one face, one race. Now, this was the rhetoric by which Italian colonialism was justified during World War II. In the Mediterranean, we're all the same anyways, so it's not even really an imperial project, although of course it was. Later in the film, once the Italians have made themselves at home on the island, the priest invites them to a beachside banquet with the words, una faccia, una pancia, one face, one stomach. My question today isn't so much about whether this gloss on Mediterranean foodways is demonstrably true in the real world, to the extent that dishes like North African shakshuka, Spanish pisto manchego, and French ratatouille are all versions of the same culinary base. It's easy enough to trace the way a particular set of ingredients is adapted and transformed across the sea. Maybe there's more rosemary in Italian cooking and more oregano in Greek, more pork in Italy and more lamb across the Adriatic, but there's certainly something to the idea of the Mediterranean diet, even if we acknowledge that its common representation is an oversimplification that elides important difference. What I want to do instead is look at how the priest's claim is enacted in film narratives of Mediterranean encounters, working with film because the impetus for this project comes from Mediterraneo, but also because the medium of film is well suited to the sheer visual quality of food. Even though my own research is mostly on literature, there's something to be said for the way film provides a more multisensory experience, a more multisensory representation of the culinary. I'd like to look briefly at three films: Abdelatif Kashish's 2007 Le Grand et les Moulets, Tassos Boumetis' 2003 Politichi Cucina, and Luca Guadagnino's 2009 Io sono l'amore. My argument is that difference in these films is a straw man. For all their anxiety about immigration in the Mediterranean, real, meaningful difference is elusive. The anxiety itself is the focus of the films. It magnifies small difference into great, creating an illusion of radical otherness. Le Grand et les Moulets was a Franco-Tunisian co-production by a Franco-Tunisian director about a Franco-Tunisian family, which I stress because the central question of the film is whether such a thing as Franco-Tunisian, with its Doridian hyphen, is in fact possible. It's a story of negotiating between identities that are posed as if they are in conflict. Can one be both French and Tunisian, or must one choose between the Mediterranean's north and south shores? The plot revolves around Slimane, the patriarch of a large family who in his old age has decided to open a couscous restaurant in a southern French city, probably based on Sète. Slimane's sprawling family act out various possibilities for integration and acculturation. The size of the cast allows the director to display a range of possible engagements between immigrants and their host countries without slipping into a binary between assimilated and non-assimilated. So we have characters like Majid here, who is unhappily married to a Russian immigrant while simultaneously having a number of affairs with other women, including both French women and North African women. Slimane, the patriarch, who we already saw, who loses his job at a shipyard because, as a naturalized French citizen, his labor has become more expensive than that of more recent migrants, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa and South America. And we have Rim, an apparently assimilated young woman who confidently navigates French bureaucracy on Slimane's behalf, but is also willing to clad herself in Orientalist costume while performing a marathon belly dance to distract hungry guests at the opening of Slimane's restaurant. When Slimane loses his job, his sons deny his Frenchness. Nothing's keeping you here, they say. You should go back home. Slimane and his ex-wife, it seems, still own a house in Tunisia, where Slimane could go to enjoy the sun and the company of his friends, though it's difficult to understand his son's suggestion that nothing is tying him to France. There is certainly ample sun on the Mediterranean's northern shore, and Slimane seems to have no shortage of friends, to say nothing of his lover Latifa, her daughter Rim, and the children and increasing numbers of grandchildren by whom he is surrounded. The crucial elements of his Maghrebi home have been transported wholesale across the sea. It might be more correct to say that nothing is drawing him back to Africa. Language provides a clue to the extent of the family's integration. The only regular usage of Arabic in the film is in the Bismillah the family members, not otherwise visibly religious, uniformly pronounce before eating. The experience of eating is thus continually relinked by language to the family's immigrant heritage, and food, by extension, becomes a constant reminder of homeland and cultural distinctiveness. In a way, then, every instance of eating in the Grane Le Moulet is a reinstantiation of the dislocation of Maghrebi identity in France. But this is precisely the straw man to which I earlier referred. Decades ago, perhaps, Maghrebi food would qualify as an other cuisine in France, but this is patently no longer the case. Here's the setup. Everyone in the film is concerned about Slimán's couscous restaurant. City officials don't want to issue permits, the bank is reluctant to provide a loan, and his own family thinks the plan is foolish. And on opening night, we have this encounter between French diners and Maghrebi food that gets hilariously reduced to a universalizing idea of the ethnic as opposed to the French. And there's a moment when someone is tasting a fried appetizer and says, oh, it's good, like egg rolls, as if all foreign food can just be sort of compared to itself. And then another character who wants to express a wish for the restaurant's success says, Inshallah, as they say, and her friend replies, oh, very hip, Madeline. So we're meant to be surprised, this is Madeline, we're meant to be surprised by the restaurant's success, yet the reality is that for decades, couscous has been naturalized as French fast casual food, and it's been described as the most popular comfort food in France. Why wouldn't Slimán's couscouserie succeed? There doesn't appear to be any competition in town, there are no other North African restaurants. He's filling a niche of naturalized French food in the French culinary scene. The second film I'd like to address is Tasos Bulmetis' 2003 Greco-Turkish co-production, Politiki Cousina, which is told from the perspective of Fanis in the center here. I'm sorry, the image is a bit dark. A middle-aged man in Athens reflecting upon his childhood while awaiting a visit from his grandfather, a spice merchant who lives in Istanbul. Fanis was a young boy in Istanbul in 1964 when the Turkish government revoked the right of Greek citizens who were born in Turkey to live and work there. With the exception of his grandfather, who held Turkish citizenship, Fanis' family was forced to return to Greece, a country which many of them, in fact, had never been to. The film carries us through a series of linked conversations about cooking, masculinity, and Greekness. From a young age, Fanis demonstrates extraordinary talent in the kitchen, and concerned, his parents eventually call a priest to exorcise their apartment, and this priest, even as he compliments Fanis' cooking, grumbles, quote, Fanis must get out of the kitchen. Did our Lord Jesus cook? Never. Just now and again he fended for bread and wine. Soon thereafter, Fanis' father is summoned to Fanis' school, where his teacher demands, what language do you speak at home? Well, Greek, of course, but with a Turkish dialect? Does it matter? Of course, it causes him to make mistakes. You must do something to vitalize his sense of ethnic pride. So we have a linking of language and cuisine here, which harkens back to the Bismillah of La Grane Le Moulet, and indicates the confusion the film explores about what makes someone Greek or Turkish. And Fanis mournfully observes upon his family's deportation from Istanbul when he's just a child. The Turks sent us away as Greeks, while the Greeks received us as Turks. These fraught encounters draw a complicated portrait of masculinity inextricably bound up with nationality. Fanis' cooking of the cuisine of Constantinople presents an ontological risk. The food threatens to make him less Greek, less Christian, and even less of a man. In order to be naturalized as a Greek Orthodox male, he is asked to stop producing the foods of his past. And then the story jumps forward in time without showing us how Fanis recovers from all this childhood drama. We see him briefly as a young man working in a professional kitchen, and then suddenly he's middle-aged, a professor of astronomy and astrophysics, who continues to cook Istanbuli Greek food at home. And he's apparently made some sort of compromise, confining his Istanbuli inclinations to the private and familial spheres while living publicly as unassailably Greek. It seems half the film takes place in the kitchen, and the camera luxuriates in panning slowly across table after table laden with colorful dishes. The culinary provides the healing counterweight to the rupture of his deportation from Turkey, offering Fanis an unbreakable link with Istanbul, his spice merchant grandfather, and the past. But the political story is largely divorced from the culinary one. We could read the food in the film as a metaphor for the political history of contemporary Greece and Turkey, but really politics and food seem to operate in separate spheres. It's like two stories squished together, one about the population exchange and one about a young boy who loves to cook, and the links between them are not clear. It seems key to me that the difference between Istanbuli Greek food, the politiki cuisine of the title, and, I'm not sure, real Greek food, it's never addressed what this distinction is. We're meant to understand that politiki cuisine is somehow distinct from what Greeks eat in Greece. The one moment in the film when the distinctiveness of this food is addressed, though, contrasts it not with the Greek food of Greece, but with the Greek food of another Turkish Greek community. So we know that politiki cuisine is uniquely Istanbuli, but we don't know to what extent it resembles either Turkish or Greek national food, only that a Greek from another part of Turkey recognizes it. This is a kind of micro-distinction that belies the whole point of the film's political story about the population exchange. We're no longer discussing Greece's reception of Turkish Greeks, but rather smaller-scale differences between Turkish Greeks themselves. So, La Grande et le Moulet is about an otherness that I'm not convinced is really any longer so other. And politiki cuisine is about difference that fails to even be described. The last film I'm going to talk about, Luca Guadagnino's Io sono l'amore, I'm presenting as a kind of counterexample of a difference so radical that it can't be assimilated, only demolished. The movie tells the story of Emma Reiki, the Russian wife of a Milanese textiles heir, as she, middle-aged with 3 grown children, tears apart her life, falling from a vague restlessness into a torrid affair and thence into a kind of emotional catatonia, from which she finally emerges reborn. This affair finds Emma involved with a chef named Antonio, a friend of her oldest son, and their relationship unfolds through food. First, he brings a cake to her house for her son. She doesn't really notice him, but then he comes back to cook dinner for her son's birthday, and she falls in love. But with his food first, and then with him as the man who made it. And the first dish of his she tastes is an insalata russa, and this inaugurates a weird culinary exchange. She's lured by his Russian salad, and then allows him to make Italian food for her. Then again, is insalata russa Russian food or Italian food, right? It's hard to say. As their relationship develops, though, she insists on teaching him to cook her most treasured recipe, which is a Russian fish soup called ukha. To understand Emma's attraction to Antonio, you have to know the tenor of her marriage. Her husband basically stole her away from Russia and brought her to Milan, where he gave her a new name, Emma, which she's been known by so long that she claims to not even remember her Russian name. This signifies a sort of emptying out of herself. When we first meet her, it's her in front, or sort of on the left. When we first meet her, she's polishing silver at home. She has blonde hair and pale skin and neutral clothes that all just sort of blend into one another. She's a blank, and the progression of the film suggests that Antonio offers her an awakening. The plot moves us from Milan in gray winter to Antonio's farm outside San Remo in glorious summer. And I think that this is a fundamentally Mediterranean move to the warm coast from a cold northern city, which seems to directly echo Franco Cassano's formulations in Pensiero Meridiano. The whole point is that she began her life as Russian, and moving to Italy is meant to be seen as utterly incompatible with that. Her difference is so extreme that it can't be assimilated. First, she has to be utterly emptied out by her sterile life with the Recchi family, and only then is she ready to receive Antonio's rough Mediterranean vitality as a vacuous vessel. She gorges herself on him and on his food. When they have sex, it's almost always outdoors, evoking ancient linkages between food and sex and the land. It's this rough, primal scene. And the first time they have sex, it's done with all these glorious shots of Emma with the pale skin, and she's wearing a coral dress on the vibrant green ground, and she's bathed in sun. She drags her hand through tall grasses and brings the earthy smell to her face, removes her sunglasses and tilts her head back towards the sky. She opens up, blossoming alongside the natural world around her. In a later sex scene, also at Antonio's farm, shots of Emma and Antonio's bodies are intercut with flowers and insects, making their sex rough and natural and organic, seeming to emerge from the land itself. The transition from Milan to San Remo and from winter to spring to summer, from cold marble to warm earth, reinforces the theme of her awakening. The only false note here is the ukha, the Russian fish soup. Why does Emma teach Antonio this Russian dish, even as she's becoming Italian? On a narrative level, it doesn't really make sense. The whole point of the story is that she becomes hollowed out by her life in Milan, and then she fills herself with some truer Italy, represented by Antonio. But Emma hardly seems to understand what's happening to her. In spite of everything, in spite of the fact that she's even lost her own name, she still seems to believe that she can carry some part of Russia forward with her. The movie's conclusion underlines the hollowness at Emma's core. She admits her affair with Antonio to her husband and that she has decided to leave him, saying, "You don't know me anymore." And he replies, "You don't exist." Her tale concludes with a suggestion of nirvana. She rushes out the front door of the Recchi's enormous Milanese mansion, and this is the open door left in her wake, and that's the last shot before the credits, presenting her absence. My point isn't that back in Mediterraneo, the priest's declaration of una faccia, una pace is true, or that it's false, which is not a question that interests me. I'd rather like to suggest that these films show something about the expectation of familiarity. What Mediterraneo presents as obvious, that Italians and Greeks are the same, indicates a trope so pervasive that Le Grand et le Mulet and Politici Cucina have to build straw men of extreme difference in order to narrate dramas of families coming together and different cultures realizing that they can, after all, be compatible. But if we stop to think about either of these two films more carefully, it's easy to see the inevitability of these differences being harmonized. In Io sono l'amore, though, Emma is forced to choose. There are no hyphens. Russo-Italian is not a thing that we're allowed to think is possible. She has to empty herself out and fill herself with the Mediterranean. And I note that these three films nearly span the Mediterranean from north to south and east to west, a full spectrum of culinary difference rendered moot by the claim of similarity, which the very idea of the Mediterranean contains at its core. Instead of radical otherness, we have radical sameness and a utopian vision of shared tables.
So here's my presentation agenda. Okay. First, I'll talk about the introduction, and then my conceptual orientations for my research. Then the methodology and the preliminary findings about food co-op in Italy in comparison with the US food co-ops, national co-op grocers. And then I will conclude the end of the presentation. So first about me, I was born in Japan, and I grew up with the Japanese food co-ops. And also, I was a farmer, but I've lived in the US for 25 years. This is my mother and the garden. Back in Japan, October, I was visiting. And there, my son, I took one of the 4 kids to my hometown in October, and they were planting mushrooms. Right? They sell and for also consumption too. These are wild mushrooms that my mother is picking in the woods. And these are my sister's parents-in-law. They grow grapes. It was in season in October. Right? It's a big business in my hometown. Here's my mother's home cooking with my son. Corn and many other ingredients from the garden, and they always, growing up, I took everything for granted, and eating food at a restaurant and buying food and snacks from convenience stores were more exciting, and I never liked the food. Then going back home from the time to time, I realized how delicious and precious and wonderful they are, very fresh. And this was a birthday party for my son. My sister and her husband are there, some sushi and some cakes. And one of them I heard was a tiramisu. And here we go. So this is I am, and this is where I come from. One thing about the food, or one thing about the family culturally, is that my mother or sister or anyone ever in Japan told me, "I love you." They never said that. My former fiancée never said that either. Maybe that's why she left me. But that was a long time ago, right? 30 years ago, so behind everything. But nobody said I love you. But it's the food. It's how it's prepared. And that's so abundant. Food connects us all. everyone. Okay, so conceptual framework orientations. Okay, I have 4 cooperatives and corporatocracy, cultural discourse analysis, and national co-op grocers, and promotion of peace and justice. So these are the 4 orientations I use as a vantage point of view for my analysis. I try, go quickly here. Cooperatives, 2012 was the year of cooperatives at the United Nations. So it's very important, and there are 7 principles which I will talk about later if I have time. But the cooperatives are basically businesses of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's why the United Nations chose the COP 2012 as the year of the cooperatives. And the cooperatives are great for promoting equal employment, stable economic growth, environmental sustainable businesses, food security, democracy, and empowering people who are involved in that business. And there's a cycle of poverty, radicalism, and violence, and that would lead to more poverty. So this is one reason United Nations decided that it's good to address cooperatives to address the poverty and to break the cycle. That's the one way we could promote peace and justice. And there are 3 good functions of the cooperatives. Interconnectedness among all the interbeings and food and the diverse people and the political divides, religious divides. Cooperatives can interconnect with people. And the fundings, very often money, the investment might come from within the community. When a community is in conflict, outside investment can be limited, but cooperatives can generate income and investment from inside. And also, diverse people can work together because that's profitable to work together as opposed to fighting. That's one conceptual orientation through which I look at food co-ops. And that's good for peace and justice. Apology for a little different formatting, a little bit. And then the next one is a corporatocracy. It is a society governed and controlled by corporate interests. It is a part of globalization, not the globalization per se, but it is a major part of globalization. There are 4 stages that this corporatocracy is achieved by John Perkins. Okay. First, the 4 stages are corruptions, conflicts, assassinations, and war. Okay. So John Perkins was an economic hitman, according to himself. I listened to his talk, and that's what he did. The first one is corruptions. That is to go and talk to political leaders and to bribe them or threaten them. Sign this deal, business deal. So you will be really, really rich, but your nation might go down in poverty. But you will be rich. You will stay in power. Sign the contract. So that's the corruption part. That's where the economic hitman will go. If that fails, there will be a threat. And the economic hitman could imply, or it wouldn't say directly, but, well, you see some other countries and democratic uprisings and the human rights abuses, internal riots and conflicts and civil wars. You know what happens to those places? So in the second stage, so-called jackals are sent to create problems for the politicians who do not agree with scary contracts or not to be corrupted. If the conflict, civil rights movement, or a civil war or internal conflicts do not replace the leaders, then there will be an assassination attempt against those who oppose the corruptions and survive conflicts. That's the third stage. The fourth stage is war. Okay. War in Iraq in recent time, for example. It is a scary story, but globalization is not all about this, but this is a major part, the prominent in globalization. So all these, especially conflicts part, is done, internal conflicts or demonstrations are done in the name of democracy, promoting democracy, human rights, and replacing dictators. Okay. Rhetorically speaking. Okay. So for example, John Perkins talks about where he was active between 1971 and early 2000s. Israel, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, to mention a few in this nearby region. So that's another corporatocracy through which I look at the co-op, why co-ops are very important. This is the communication theory, so I focus on communication as the primary focus. This is where I start looking at what we do, such as cooking, buying food, growing food, walking, sharing meal together. And then I'll try to find out some special cultural meanings associated with that. Then I try to look at functions, what is being accomplished here through our communication practices. Then these three elements mainly constitute the personhood analysis. Okay, this is a comparison between the Coop Italy and the US food co-op. Okay. Then, and fourth orientation, this is the work I have done in National Co-op and Grocers and promotion of peace and justice through ordinary grocery shopping. So don't go into details here, but culture of when you use co-op in the US, according to my analysis, at least 8 elements: culture of interconnectedness, connecting with everyone, nature, people, animals, the public health, environmental stewardship, reducing oil consumption, food security, economy, social justice, and the public policy. They can be all promoted. And in my abstract original planning of my research, I did not include reducing oil consumption, but I was influenced by the conference that was going on in France and the global warming that we face every day. That's why I included reducing oil consumption. That is very important to address combat with environmental stewardship. And this is from the US, being smart, meaning going to the best bargain and for the best value, and the largest amount. That's being smart. Being conscious is more about thinking about all these 8 areas as you starting to choose what ingredients you'd like to buy. Vegetables, from where? For how much? Is it worth it to pay a little bit more for organic, more healthy? I wish I were an economist to do that analysis, but I'm a communication scholar. All right. So conflicts associated with, in particular, I'd like to just mention that, as you might know, it's sometimes not nice to talk about the direct connection between oil, environment, and big conflicts, of course. But I thought I would mention that. And the 9/11 terrorist attacks, at least partly, had to do with oil. Invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, had to do with oil. Arab Spring revolutions and ISIS and the current going, at least partially, they have to do with the oil. in the US media, as far as I know, in the mainstream US media or media in Japan, that part, the role that oil plays is rather silent. So people don't make much connection, but oil is very, very important. But my purpose is not here to antagonize or demonize oil or people who work for the oil. Okay? All right. So these are the vantage point of view that I use for my analysis. And here's the methodology. I looked at first websites of National Coop Grocers Association and River Valley Coop. That is but I'm on the board, and I go shopping there frequently. And the participatory observation, because I'm a shopper and I'm on the board, and I got to know a lot about food co-ops in the United States. And also, this was a very hard part. Websites of, I had to only could focus on websites about the co-op in the Mediterranean region. I had a hard time finding, looked through, and for about 2 months, and articles, and I had a really, really hard time. Then I realized, according to David Thompson, an expert on food co-ops in the US, says that Coop Italy and the co-ops in the Italy is the biggest and the fastest growing co-ops in the Mediterranean region. So I thought, I'm going to Italy. And now I focus on Italy. And this was the most prominent website that I could gather information. All right. So that's where the Coop Italy comes in for my analysis. And, right? But limitations are enormous because I don't speak the languages in those countries. And the website is the one. And I had no participatory observations. So like the past 2 days or 3 days, I've been to Conad and the supermarket and the food co-op, and I had a great fun shopping. I even set off an alarm. I pushed through the gate, and somebody was shouting behind me. I didn't know that I couldn't push the gate. But so I've been having great fun shopping, not knowing the system at all. So confusing and overwhelming. Okay. All right, this is my backup file. Okay, so this is coming down to the my analysis. What you see is a conceptual framework of a communication. Okay. I have less than 5 minutes. I try to wrap it up. Okay. The co-op and US co-ops are being compared. Okay. So consumer-owned co-ops, environmental, sustainability, promote co-ops, being respectful and mindful and conscious. And 7 principles that were conceived in Britain in mid-1800s and promoted by the United Nations as well. Then interpretations. This is where the moment of the truth. And I'd like to hear many comments later. Okay, the co-op is you, the supermarket. Okay, in the US, it's very strong focus on local and small stores. Animal welfare, all the people, current and the future generations. I thought that was amazing. Community and the concerns and the farmers, they focus more on in the US. No GMOs, okay? And, but in the law, in the US, you can just label GMOs, that's happening, okay? And also good working benefits for the workers are being emphasized, okay? Savings important, and it's a great co-op here, but in the US, it's considered to be a little bit more pricey. Maybe the size and scale of the business. Okay. Culture of interconnectedness, right? So here are the direct functions, what is being accomplished as you go through shopping as you pick and choose and decide which one to buy. And so direct functions are, you could increase the awareness of how you are connected to the food environment, people who have produced them, and for whom you may be cooking too, maybe for yourself too. All right, strong, and the food co-ops are very strong and resilient, even in the time of a financial crisis. In the US, co-ops did very well during the 2008 financial crisis. What is good for local is also good for national and even global. Okay. And the reduction of fossil fuel, promotion of public health, promoting healthy food, food security is strengthened, and the policy advocacy, promoting policy that would help promote good health, reduction of fossil fuel, and environmental protection. That would lead to peace and justice. Okay, those are backup files. I had 2 backup files just in case the configurations are different. And conclusions, the promotion of co-op is one. It's not the only one, okay, but it's one very significant power that ordinary people can use for promotion of peace and justice while enjoying food. And as we talk about food and get together with the food, and they can cultivate the special meanings associated with the shopping, walking, cooking, eating, protecting the environment, and having fun. Of course, promotion of peace and justice. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I became interested in food story very early because my family is from northern India and I was raised in southern Kansas. And so it was very obvious that the things on the plate in my house after 5 p.m. when I shut the door and got home was very different than the things on the plate of all my friends' families. And it was a difference that was not unpleasantly different, but definitely a different story behind those foods. And this carries over into everybody's world. I think culinary traditions have long been a bridge between cultures in the Mediterranean, but really everywhere. Food story is rich in the social, religious, and sensory and agricultural detail. I teach in the College of Agriculture, and so I think about food all the way from soil to plate, sensory as well as details, taste and flavor, but also food security and hunger. So all of these issues are all encased in how the foods got to our plates. And I think that it's a story of the soil, it's the story of the people who tend it, it's the story of the fields that are harvested and even the fruits that appear on trees in the right season. Tomatoes found their first home in South America. Pasta perhaps in the desert nations of the Arabs. The merging of these foodstuffs and by the cultures of the Mediterranean and elsewhere to their own taste showcase not only the unity but the diversity of our world. Food trails across borders are our living history because it continues to change. All cultures hold their food dear. It's more than sustenance. It holds memory, it holds desire, it holds reward from frustration, and it holds a link to place. All this is true, but I feel the simple act of eating contains a multitude of stories. It's not only what we eat and cook, but our ideas of what tastes good that have changed over time. And the recipes have changed, and all the ways these foods are put together they come together by no accident on our plate. Flavor preferences have shifted dramatically over time due to specific historical, social, religious, even political reasons. 500 years ago, you would have found sugar and cinnamon sprinkled on every dish on your plate, liberally. And the order of the meal, the cooking technology has changed dramatically as well. The way the kitchen staff is organized in restaurants, the manners that govern the dining table, the rituals of eating, develop in very different ways around the world. So let's start with a little history. Very little, since we don't have too much time. So agriculture was the first single most important event, and I'm going to say events because it was more than one scattered around the world, in human history. The Fertile Crescent of Iraq, Syria, Eastern Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, about 8,500 BC, was the first place that agriculture took place. And I think it happened there primarily because of a lot of easily domesticated animals and plants were in the area, like sheep and goats that were naturally herding animals, but also the wild ancestor of wheat was everywhere. High protein content, 8 to 14%, was not as much as the meat of our hunter-gatherer forebearers, but after Homo sapiens sapiens started to stay put, in fact, people could live on that and make it a basis for their diet. So, if you can. In fact, wheat and a select other few plants like teff in Ethiopia, corn in Mesoamerica, rice in Asia, potatoes, sorghum, what we know of civilization would never have happened in the Fertile Crescent or elsewhere. So dairy products were new then. Benign bacteria made the new foods, bread, cheese, wine, beer, yogurt, and we started to control the process. Wine became essential to socially and religiously. Olives, pickled vegetables, fruits that are dried, salted things. Many of these plants, for instance, the olive might take up to 12 years, force people to stay put and specialize. This creates trade. Olive oil stored in huge clay pots were shipped all over the Mediterranean. The ability to store quantities of food means you do not have to move on. The diet was less varied, but it was consistent. The land started to be altered to grow crops. We were plowing, irrigating. We started to deplete the soil of nutrients, and this prompted people to move elsewhere and invade neighbors, and we became more warlike because of our food. The agricultural revolution created many species that we raised for food and changed us from being part of many competing species to being the dominant species on the planet. So once agriculture started, for the first time in history, food became more than calories. It became an identifier. It revealed personal choices and thus values, ambitions, where that person fits in a society. In the 19th century, Jean Brillant-Savant says, "Tell me what you eat and I'll tell you what you are," which suggests that people often use food to express who they are. Food is a kind of message, it's a communication. But food is also something that reveals cultural values. Think about a banquet hall in medieval times. Who's seated at the head table above others? Think about what's on the plate at that time, liberal seasonings, these tiny bits of larger things that have come halfway across the globe through numerous middlemen, causing it to be extremely expensive. And the guests are just about ready to consume those expensive things for their stomachs. Consider how different a message that is than sitting down to a cozy dinner for two, or getting a burger at an American tailgate, or a barbecue outdoors. Totally different messages. So it sends a cultural message as well. And thirdly, food is a major catalyst throughout history. The accidental discovery of the New World, I'm sure you all are aware, was caused because of the search for spices. Population surges in China was due, perhaps, to the sweet potato. Even modern warfare was due to advances in food. You think about Napoleon's army marching on its stomach. Many of the mass migrations through history were prompted because of food, prehistoric times all the way to the Irish potato famine. So Claire Sponsler tells a story in her article, Eating Lessons, about Irish kings who traveled to England in 1394 to pledge submission to England's King Richard. The squire was sent with them to educate them on the English ways. He put up with 3 days of travel, the Irish kings eating at the same tables with their subjects, their squires, and their servants, even sharing the same plates. And by the fourth day, he couldn't stand it any longer. They had to change. He told them that they had to, he rearranged the table arrangements. The 4 kings were at the head table. The squires were at a separate table. The servants were at a third. And the Irish kings objected, saying that's not the way their culture did things. But they had to comply because what was happening within the dining room reflected what was happening outside the walls of the buildings. They had submission, political submission, reinforced the idea of replication of submitting to food culture rules. So sometimes food choices are further elaborated into formal code, kosher for Jewish or vegetarianism, that encompasses an entire worldview on how we should treat animals. In this way, food ideology can express so much more than just taste, right? We all have to eat to survive, but when we consciously choose one food or reject others, it means that food is an excellent way to analyze culture in general, or a particular person's character. Greeks, of course, mixed wine with water and drank it at symposium. Plato's symposia, at his sessions, he held that wine revealed truth, and it was a test of your personality. And Greek wine embodied Greek culture. Their values went along with it. Wine was exported and traded on a massive scale at the time. They spread wine and its knowledge of its cultivation, introduced winemaking to Sicily, southern Italy, southern France. Vast amounts of Greek wine and drinking vessels were also exported here to Italy, where Etruscans enthusiastically embraced the custom of symposia to demonstrate their own sophistication. Of course, as we're doing a version of that here this weekend, so I don't know if maybe we all had some wine right now, I'd sound a lot better or something. By the middle of the 2nd century, Romans had displaced the Greeks as a dominant power in the Med, and it was sort of a strange victory since the Romans, like many other Europeans, like to show sophistication by appropriating aspects of Greek culture, specifically food and wine Greek culture. But there was an undercurrent of another viewpoint. Some Romans, like Cato, saw Greeks as having a bad influence. They saw themselves as unpretentious farmers turned soldiers and then administrators. Wine countered this conflict by bridging the two cultures' values. Romans, as farmers, were rewarded often with farmland after victories, and vines were the most prestigious crop. So they could feel they were true to their roots, but also embrace Greek-style living and drinking. Okay. So cultivating vines was honest and down to earth, but the resulting wine was a symbol of civilization for the Romans. Beginning in the 2nd century, Greek wine still dominated the Mediterranean wine trade and was the only produce being exported in significant quantities to the Italian peninsula. But by 70 BC, Pliny the Elder estimated that of the 80 wines of note in the Roman world, 2/3 were grown in Italy. So what was in those glasses was cultural and an agricultural bridge. Fine wine equals social status, and in this case, the finest wine of all, was, by universal assent, was Valerian. It was Italian, grown in Campania, and its name became a byword for luxury. Again, it showed off cultural values. Roman feasts served wines calibrated for the social order, which differed greatly from the Greek symposium, where in theory participants drank as equals. Dining habits have always changed over time. For example, in the Roman Republican period, people lived with great frugality, very austere life with a simple diet. They ate pretty much what we think of as a Mediterranean diet today, wheat, barley instead of corn, polenta, but otherwise it was cheese, olive oil, vegetables, a little meat now and then. The rich and poor ate the same frugal diet. There were few luxuries that you could flaunt, by which you could flaunt your wealth, but this changes in an imperial Rome. As expansion happened, simple Romans came in contact with older and wealthier cultures that were used to luxuries, connected with ancient trade routes, spices from Asia like pepper, cinnamon from India, even products from the Far East like citron, ginger, cloves. They were a little bit later, but still it affected what the choices were. Excellent, and they were all excellent markers of social status that only the wealthiest could afford. But in the minds of many Romans, contact with the East had made this once fierce people soft. During this time, there's a great deal of social mobility, even in the slave class. When people suddenly made a lot of money, They were able to rise up socially, and they naturally wanted to imitate their superiors. They wanted to speak properly, buy expensive villas, eat the same foods as the wealthy did. And food was an unmistakable marker of social class. The dinner party was the most important social event, and who was invited, and what was served, and all the ingredients used, from how far away they came. The social aspirants were, in a sense, performing their new status at every dinner. It was only with social mobility that foods become infused with such meaning. At one level, food is a much deeper association, especially with class. It's a marker of identity that expresses who we wish to be or who we revile or despise. So, hang on a second, if you can switch. I'm going to go through this quickly. Officiais wrote On Cooking, or De Re Mediterranea. It was the most famous cookbook of classical times, written about 200 years after the likely historical Officiais. He was renowned for his exquisite taste and extravagant sums that he spent on food. His name was universally associated with magnificence and dining and extravagance. And his cookbook on cooking bears witness to this reputation for lavishness. It contained recipes with a wild juxtaposition of flavors: sweet, sour, savory, spicy, competing all in one dish. African ostrich is in a recipe that includes Indian pepper, dates from the Middle East, garum from Spain, which was the Roman fish sauce. Ingredients from far-flung reaches of the world, which might reflect the jaded palates of the Roman, but it also was designed to impress wealth and sophistication and shows the world on one plate, literally. And you can tell when reading the book, it was written for someone who did not know how to create these lavish banquets. So it was for those with social aspirations. Okay. There were other authors, of course, who rejected this way of eating and its associated values. And Juvenal, the satiric Roman poet, was one. In his poetry number 11, he tells, after making fun of one of the banquets in a rigorous way, he tells his friend to come by his farm, get things you can't get at the market. From the fields, the fattest kid in the flock, the tenderest, more milk in him than blood. There will be fresh eggs, great big ones, with straw stuck on the shells. And he continues in this vein. And just like today, what he's saying is there are those with an alternative aesthetic that reject the fancy and expensive foods for honest, simple foods prepared without fuss. Then the printing press happens. I'm running through this a little quicker than probably necessary, or it's necessary, but my preferred way. But the printing press happens. There's a rise in literacy, and there's a lot more how-to books. It speeds the pace of change. There's some classical literature written, but also there was books on cooking, diet, manners, agriculture, herbals. It was a major communications revolution. The classical revival movement was humanism. It was very practical, ethics, not abstract theology, rhetoric rather than logic, poetry and art rather than law. It was a major shift in curriculum. And the values of the culture shifted. They wanted a well-rounded citizen, the humanities. So we get an everyday topic that becomes worthy of study. In the first printed cookbook in English, Honest Pleasure, about 1470 in Rome by Bartolomeo Platina. It was two books, really. One book, Recipes Borrowed from the Cardinal Chef Martino, and the other book was Platina's own, Natural History, Biology, Dietary Medicine, Medical Properties, and they didn't fit well together. There would be a recipe from Martino, and then the next page would be Platina's description of how that wasn't healthy for you. But anyway, he put it together. He translated the Italian recipes into Latin, which was unusual, and it preached moderation and balance. So compared to what we had just had with the feasts, over-the-top kind of feasts, this was a different message. Sugar was now cultivated in other parts of the world, and it was traded extensively. People loved sugar, and they put it on everything. So there was a new aesthetics in the arts at that time. It was mannerisms, which was twisted positions, illogical settings, and anatomy was ignored. It was surprising, and the form was to display wit and inventiveness that flattered the spectator that got it, right? So the leading artists of the day often were commandeered to design feasts. So food started to reflect this very same approach. And so you got very strange feasts. There's stories of the guests arriving to all the food painted on tables rather than actual food, because the idea was to almost play tricks on eaters. So about the same time all this is going on here, across the Mediterranean and across the world, in the Aztec civilization, what we get is corn, a generic term in Europe that referred to a primary grain crop, was brought to the Old World from the Aztecs. And there's much more to be said about that, but the initial resistance to American crops was something that was overcome if it was familiar, if it was made into familiar recipes. So Europe resisted strange new grain, what we call corn, except where it borrowed from foods already known. So here in Italy, it became the chief cereal when polenta was made from it. The downside is sometimes foods that were borrowed, not all the techniques of making them were borrowed at the same time. So outbreaks of pellagra, a vitamin deficiency disease caused by lack of niacin and protein, came with corn because it became a staple of a large portion of the population's diet. But in the New World, corn kernels were treated with lime to remove the tough skin, which made niacin available to the diet. That didn't happen here, so there was a problem in the beginning. So in the mid-15th century in Venice, of course, there was a monopoly of the spice trade, silk, gold, drugs, and other things. They were brought to the rest of Europe through this port. And of course, the price was astronomically high by the time they reached Europe. Then the Portuguese eventually rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and went directly east across the Indian Ocean. Within 10 years, Lisbon became the largest, wealthiest port in Europe, and it successfully cut out the Venetians. And in the short term, the prices of spice remained high. But in about 100 years, it comes down. And the effect of that valuation of spice changed what showed up on the plates, because by 1700, spices were out of fashion with elite cooking. Ordinary people still ate them, but it wasn't special anymore. Remember that dining was a show of what you served and how important and sophisticated you were, so why would you serve something that even peasants could afford? So during this time, Columbus finally got backed by Spain to make his voyage for spices. And the importance of this in food terms is that America is suddenly directly linked with the old world. And sugar becomes available in such great quantity that it goes out of fashion as well in elite cooking. And it got marginalized into desserts, which is maybe where it should be, but anyway. And ordinary people still eat it a lot, and candy is everywhere. So the Spanish under Cortez conquer the Aztecs, Pizarro conquers in Peru, and then the Spanish conquer Manila. This is important because the entire world is now linked economically. The Spanish introduce European plants and animals to America. We get cattle, horses, pigs from the islands, chicken, wheat, and all the European fruits and vegetables. These displace native fauna, dandelions, and I want to thank you all very much in Europe. You gave us dandelions, carrots, which are Queen Anne's lace. It was ecological imperialism. People conquered, but so did germs. In the Aztec Valley, in 100 years, went from 25 million people to 1 million people due to disease. So it was people that conquered, but germs did, and so did plants and animals. They completely upset the local ecosystems, and many species, in fact, go extinct. In many cases, there were no natural predators, so everything reproduced like mad. Grasses across America to this day are not native to North America. They came from Europe. It went both ways, but for the first time in human history, plants from all 5 continents are jumbled together. They're mixed up, and it completely changes eating habits everywhere. So Europeans usually were the slowest to adopt a lot of the foods, the new foods, but why were some foods adopted and not others? The Portuguese were still in control of the spice trade, and were great control of it. And they didn't want to sell certain spices that would compete with other things. Why would they sell the chili pepper everywhere and compete with their own pepper imports from India? So they banned it. They did not want to sell it anywhere that they would hurt their economic interests. But they sold it other places. The Ottoman Empire, Hungary, paprika there, India, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, China, and it spread rapidly because it could grow easily. And for poor people, it became a replacement for expensive spices. It went to Africa too. Chili pepper didn't come to Europe for a long time. The first recipe, I think, of it was in the 1790s here. Almost all New World foods, when they get to Europe, are used completely differently than they were used in South America. As you probably know, tomatoes didn't catch on for a long time. Poor Spanish people were using them in the 16th century, but those who could afford stayed away. It didn't really fit into any culinary niche that was existing. Belladonna was a scary thing. They couldn't serve it as a substitute for a European food. But there was quite a few foods that were, that just quickly, that came from there that you may be aware of. Foods from the New World: squash, zucchini. Gourds were from the Old World, but zucchini was from the New. Pumpkin, cassava, beans, tomatoes, chilies, amaranth, cactus, avocado, guava, navy pinto string beans, onions, tomatoes, vanilla, cacao, potatoes, sunflowers, peanuts, okra from Africa, pineapple, bananas, kola nut, sesame, both from Africa, macadamia nuts from Australia, barbecue, which was an Arawak term, whom we wiped out with disease, from America, coffee from Ethiopia. From the Old World, there was pigs, cattle, asparagus, wine grapes. It was 1492 marked not only a discovery of the New World by Europeans, but a discovery of the entire world by everyone. Just after this time, European cuisines blossomed. This was early 17th century and 16th century. There was culinary innovations. There was cheaper spices, New World plants. The old noble practices were more available. National cuisines came about. Now people are buying cookbooks and reading them in the vernacular, and this begins to develop into more strongly regional cuisines: Italian, French, Spanish, English, Dutch, Japanese. Now there are actually nation states, and there are more strongly pronounced food prejudices as well. The expression of national cuisines due to nation states excludes the other. National food ideology was meant to create distinctions between various people. It was used between peasants and nobles in the past, but now it's between nations. It was a conscious fabrication. National boundaries were created for political purposes. They justify a state that imposes taxes. So, for instance, the people of northern Spain might have had more in common with the people of southern France and perhaps Italy than the Castilian capital of Spain, but they were separated into distinct nations and distinct cuisines. So, just to wrap up, to use today's word, globalization, it turns out it was not one event, but it has been going on for a long time. It's evolving for many centuries. It started out partly due to explorations, economic expansion, but it was also because spices and the desire for other luxury items, that's what literally connected the globe. In 1826, Jean Brillant-Savant said, "The future of nations will depend on how they feed themselves." Almost 200 years later, how nations feed themselves has become and continues to grow richer, I feel, through the mixing of food cultures. So, thank you.